Hi folks, this is a video about language analysis, particularly for the AQA GCSE English Language qualification. For AQA that is paper 1 question 2, but if you are doing a different exam board it will also be assessed in a different question maybe, so it is fundamentally the same skill, just different exam boards. For this presentation, I'm not actually going to be using a past paper or any exemplar materials from AQA. I've actually decided to write my own question for this. It's also important to remember that there is an infinite number of novels out there that you can always use to practice these same skills. We don't always have to use AQA's materials, we can actually use our own. So if you have read a novel that you like in the past, you might want to use that as a way of, I suppose, practicing the questions, the skills. So we're going to be using Lord of the Flies by William Golding, which is a novel that I read myself for my GCSE in literature at the end of year 10. I can remember it well. So that novel has stuck with me, I suppose, and therefore I have used it to write my own question and use it to practice the language question. So I'm going to start this presentation by just introducing you to Lord of the Flies briefly. This obviously isn't a literature course, but it's sometimes useful to contextualize the extract, as would be the case at the top of the extract. They give you a little synopsis telling you what it is about. And then I'm going to go into the question, and then going to highlight the words and phrases that depict a particular setting. And then I'm going to talk about how to develop your response, and then I'm going to finish this presentation by showing you two examples of a response, one which is level 2 and one which is level 4. So I don't mean grade 2 or 4, I mean level 2 or 4, okay, in terms of the mark scheme. So Lord of the Flies was published in 1954 by William Golding, and it's about a group of boys that get stuck or marooned on an island, and they have to live to learn together. And initially, everything goes fine. They elect a leader in the character of Jack. They have very democratic meetings. They use a conch, which is a very large shell, to symbolise a meeting or a gathering, like a school bell, as a way to get people together. And initially, the boys seem to be able to live together in harmony. However, as time goes on, the boys' behaviour gets increasingly savage and increasingly erratic. And I'm not going to spoil it, but at the end of the novel, their behaviour is very different to the beginning. So on the surface, this novel is about a group of children living together, or boys, about them living together on an island and having to work together. But the novel also poses, I suppose, deeper questions about society and civilization more generally, not just for children but for adults. So what would happen, for example, if we didn't have any laws or any rules? Would people behave themselves regardless, or would there be a sense of lawlessness because people like the fact there were no longer any laws or rules? So it's all about really living together and, I suppose, human nature in a way as well. Think about if all the teachers were taken out of your school or college. Do you think the students would behave or not? Think about if we had no police force. Do we think crime would go up or go down? So it's a question. It's a novel really about human nature, but the boys and the island is used as a device really to discuss that. The reason why we have a picture there of The Simpsons, or at least some of the characters on The Simpsons, is because The Simpsons actually parodied this novel, I think in series 9 of the sitcom. And their Otto's school bus crashed into the sea. I think it fell off a bridge somehow, and the children swam to safety on an island, and they had to learn to live together. And initially it was orderly. They elected, I think, Bart as the leader, but as time went on, their behaviour started to get more erratic, and the food became a problem because they had to rationalise the food, and Milhouse, I think, ate everything. And they tried to conduct their own mock trial, and it ended up with Bart, Lisa and Milhouse kind of running for safety in a cave to escape the other children who were chasing them with spears and things. So that episode of The Simpsons parodied this novel. You might have watched that episode and not realised, but it is a parody of Lord of the Flies. So, without further ado, let's go into the question itself. How does the writer use language to describe the island? And the reason why I've highlighted the end bit of that task is because the language question will always have a specific focus. It won't just be general, it will be a specific focus. So everything that we highlight, everything that we say, will have to be to do with describing the island. If you have watched a previous video of mine for language, you will know that I always tell my students at least to cross off that third bullet point. Although it's down to your teacher's discretion. I tell my students to do that because they struggle to talk about the effects of a sentence length, but also the following question is structure, and you might want to keep sentence lengths or forms in reserve to talk about structure. So primarily we're looking at words and phrases and language devices and techniques. This is 8 marks, 10 minutes max, 2 paragraphs max. So again, it's a very short, snappy question. There isn't a lot of time, so it is really a snapshot, I suppose, of what you can do. So you will need a highlighter or a pen to jot down or to highlight this if you've printed it off or written it out. I'm going to read it, and then what I would like you to do is to highlight or underline or circle the words or phrases that you think are important in terms of how this island is depicted to you. So the shore was fledged with palm trees. These stood or leaned or reclined against the light, and their green feathers were 100 feet up in the air. The ground beneath them was a bank covered with coarse grass, torn everywhere by the upheavals of fallen trees, scattered with decaying coconuts and palm saplings. Behind this was the darkness of the forest. Ralph stood and screwed up his eyes against the shimmering water. Out there the white surf broke on a coral reef, and the open sea was dark blue. The lagoon was still as a mountain lake, blue of all shades and shadowy green and purple. So while you're highlighting or circling or jotting things down in terms of the words you might want to use, you can tell that this is a very descriptive paragraph full of lots of descriptions to do with colour and texture and size as well, and light and dark. So as you might know from paper 1 question 5, when you have to write your own piece of description or story, you will have been told that descriptive writing is all about the senses, and it's about conveying a particular place to a reader who isn't there. So the way to do that is through the senses, through sights, sounds and so on. So clearly what William Golding is doing here, quite early on in the novel, is to help us visualise this island. And that is essentially what this question is about. It's about how do you visualise this island. And you will visualise this island based on the words that the writer uses. They are in control of the imagery that we have in our mind. So I've said this in a previous video that language is a manipulative tool. It's only from the language that we will react to a text in a certain way and feel certain things. So you can pause the video here to finish highlighting, or you can continue. So here we have the words and phrases that I have decided that I think are quite useful for this. Again, textures, this idea of feathers and coarse. We've also got light and dark, so shimmering and darkness. And then we've also got lots of colours, white, purple, green, blue. So it's those colours which help create a sense of imagery. In a previous video, I used, I can't remember which text it was now, I think it was Rosabelle actually, the Rosabelle text, to talk about patterns in language and contrasts or juxtapositions. And we have something similar here. We have patterns of colours, really, that run throughout most of this, as well as textures as well. So you can see there that we have a pattern of colours and a pattern of textures and light and dark consistently through a relatively short amount of text. So if you can pick up on patterns, in other words, link something in the beginning to something at the end of the extract, you would get marks for that because it shows a degree of confidence in really engaging with the extract. And something that I'm a big fan of is colour coding and using highlighters and underlining things, really getting students to engage with the extract and not kind of keeping the extract at arm's length. So these are the phrases and the words that we're going to be using for this particular response. Something that's also worth doing is, it's one of the 3 bullet points of the language mark scheme, is to think about what devices these are. I said in my very first video on YouTube, which was about language, that language analysis is not all about devices. they are the icing on the cake, the cherry on the cake. So it's always good if you can possibly talk about similes or adjectives or whatever. But students can still do well if they're able to expand on the effects of language choice in enough detail. So one of the things that I say to students from the get-go with language is it's not about learning a long list of terms. That can sometimes be unhelpful actually, because students think it is just about spotting the terms. It's not, it is about the effects. So if you can, and if you wanted, if you were curious about what devices these were, then we have the devices here. And it's always good around the outside of the extract to annotate it and to jot down, and then that just helps you speed up, I suppose, when it comes to actually writing the response. So we have a metaphor, simile, mostly adjectives as you might expect from a descriptive piece of writing, but we also have there a noun, darkness. And if you're really going to push it, we can call it an abstract noun, because darkness is not something that we can touch, it's not something we can put in a box, it's more of a concept. So darkness is an abstract noun. It's still a thing, but it's something that we can't actually touch, like a chair, for example, which would be called a concrete noun. So we have an abstract noun. So if you're looking for the very top marks, calling it an abstract noun and being as specific as possible would be a way to do that. So now that we have thought about our devices, we've now got to think about how we develop this, because we can't just say the writer uses a metaphor, the writer uses an adjective, and just list it. We have to think about why, and we have to think about what effects. So one of the ways that we can do that is through using images. So I've deliberately got an image here of an island. That is the kind of almost close, the kind of imagery, the setting, or what we might call in English the story world that the writer is trying to create for us. So they want us to see, William Golding wants us to see something like that in our heads, and that's created by the words. But we can also ask ourselves questions. So the answers to these questions will be perhaps the foundations of writing or analysis. So how is the writer trying to depict the island? What do you expect a deserted island to be like? How would you feel yourself if you were stuck on an island? Is the island presented as idyllic or something else? How does the writer create a sense of scale and texture? Why does the writer refer to so many colours? So the answer to those questions, hows and whys, can really help expand your ideas and push your response up into levels 3 and 4, because you are really expanding on the effects and impacts of language choice. So again, you might want to pause this video now and to think about the answers to those, or we can just continue. So what I've done here is I have split those quotes into 3 categories really. We've got textures, colours, and something that creates a more ominous or threatening atmosphere. One of those questions was about, is the island just idyllic, or is it something else? So I think that the writer with this island, and is often the case I suppose if you are stuck on an island without food or supermarkets or even adults to look after you if you're a child, there is something slightly more ominous here. This idea of being unsupervised children close to deep water, for example, close to slippery rocks, close to the open ocean, which has strong currents. So there is something which is slightly more ominous. So darkness of the forest. We might ask ourselves what's lurking in the forest, what's in there. Get lost in the forest, for example. The lagoon. A lagoon is quite a deep pool. So again, if you can't swim because you're still learning to swim, then that's going to be quite dangerous. But also that phrase out there, looking out to the horizon, this idea of out there, something that is maybe watching you but you can't see it, or just the vast scale of something regarding these little children on the island compared to the vastness of, you know, the horizon. Lots of colours, green, white, blue, purple, but also the adjective shimmering as well. That creates a sense of sparkling, you know, the sun sparkling on the water. And also textures. Rather than the writer just saying the trees have leaves, the writer decides to almost make the texture of those leaves and the palms seem more explicit by using a metaphor and calling them feathers, which I quite like actually. You really get a sense of the softness of these trees. But that's contrasted or juxtaposed with the coarseness of this grass, kind of sword-like grass that you can cut yourself on actually, because they're quite sharp. And then you've also got still as a mountain lake, that simile, which reminds me of a very kind of mirror-like surface to a lake, quite beautiful, but also quite dangerous, particularly if you can't swim. So we've split our ideas into 3 different categories, and that can also be helpful to look for patterns and to, I suppose, start to join it all together. In the previous video, I talked about zooming into words. So with each of these quotes, you can think about perhaps the effects of individual quotes. So the effect of darkness, the connotations of shimmering, the connotations of feathers or coarse. So even though some of these are phrases, you can still zoom into that phrase, and I think that was a video that I used for the Aberfan Paper 2 extract. So you can pause the video here and you can now perhaps have a go at writing your own response to this question. How does the writer use language to describe the island? Based on our quotes here and our annotations in terms of the devices, or alternatively, if you are just watching this through revision, you can just carry on watching the video. And I'm going to first show you a level 2 response, which is 3 out of 8 or 4 out of 8. I've also put the mark scheme on the right hand side so you can familiarise yourself with that. And I've also colour coded the responses to show you what the examiner might want to take out of these responses in terms of how they hit a particular criteria in that mark scheme. So this is a level 2 response. So I think if I was marking this, I'd probably give it a 4 out of 8, so half marks, which is scraping, I suppose, a grade 4 of the GCSE. So this is kind of consistent with getting at least a grade 4, I think, in GCSE, but it's not comfortable. So I use the phrase comfortable pass, which means that you're not just scraping a grade 4 or just scraping the GCSE. You are doing enough to comfortably get the GCSE. So this is what they wrote to get 4 out of 8. The writer presents the island as a tropical place. The trees are compared to green feathers, suggesting that they are unusual to look at and not something that we see every day. Colours, white, blue and purple, makes the island seem colourful and vibrant. The water is described as shimmering. This adjective creates a magical atmosphere of this island like it's sparkling. The simile, still as a mountain lake, creates imagery for the reader as we can really see the setting and how pretty it looks. Despite the island being pretty, it doesn't mean it is completely safe or you can survive there for long. So I've got devices, quotes and effects. I've colour-coded it. So for devices, we've got adjective and simile. So they have used there some use of subject terminology, mainly appropriately. So I'm using that for the mark scheme. They have got quotes, so select some appropriate textual detail, quite a bit actually, and effects, which is in blue there. I think the reason why I would give this 4 out of 8 instead of 3 out of 8 is really the last bit where they are able to confidently comment on the fact that even though for the majority of this extract it might seem pretty or beautiful, that there is something else going on in terms of it not being completely safe. Not only because the boys aren't being supervised, but because of dangers like deep water or things lurking that they don't know are there yet, because they haven't been there on the island very long at the minute. So this is the opening of the story, the opening of the novel. So I think because they've put that last sentence, I think I would give it a 4. But again, as is always the case with English, there is a degree of subjectivity and a degree of, I suppose, wriggle room with the marks, but I think I would give this 4. So you can see there from the colour coding, they have hit all 3 bullet points to get the kind of the half mark, the top end of level 2. So there is some understanding and comment there. So that is kind of the standard that you would need to get maybe half marks for this question. However, so I'm going to show you for the last slide of this presentation what a level 4 looks like. And because this is the top of the mark scheme, you would expect the response to get a bit longer. I've still used the same colours, the bullet points there, so we're now looking at detailed and more perceptive analysis. I think I would probably give this 7 out of 8, perhaps. But again, it's interesting to know if people disagree with that. But I think I would give this 7, just because I think maybe the effects could have been slightly more detailed in parts, but this is what they wrote anyway. The writer partly presents the island as an exotic and tropical paradise, reinforced through the sensory description of colours and textures. For example, the metaphor in which the trees are compared to green feathers suggests there is a softness to them, but also something surreal and exotic about their appearance. The softness of the trees is contrasted with the coarse grass, which implies that the grass resembles sword-like spears and is sharp. The listing of adjectives relating to vibrant colours, such as white, blue and purple, reinforce the island's tropical appearance, as if the island is like a painting which is composed with a selection of evocative colours. The fact that the water is described with the adjective shimmering foregrounds the magical atmosphere of the island, almost as if it is sparkling like crystals or precious jewels. However, despite the island's appeal, the writer also creates a sense of danger. The phrase darkness of the forest contrasts with the shimmering light and suggests something might be hiding in the forest that might pose a risk to Ralph, emphasised through the noun darkness, which has connotations of mystery and secrecy. The noun lagoon implies that there is deep water, as does the simile still as a mountain lake. As Ralph as a child, being close to deep water and being exposed to anything creates a sense of danger. The island is therefore presented as both alluring and menacing. So I quite like that last sentence actually, almost like a little conclusion, how they have also used 2 separate paragraphs to discuss how it can be seen as both alluring and exotic, but also menacing and threatening in some responses, some regards even, particularly since Ralph is a child, so there are dangers there. So again, they've hit all 3 bullet points there, devices, quotes and effects, and I think I would give this 7. There are points I think where they could have maybe just expanded a little bit more. Obviously, this is a really good response anyway, so I don't want to deduce from that if you get this kind of response, that's excellent. But I think that maybe the effects could have been a little bit expanded on at parts. But what's also, though, impressive about this, and the reason why it is perceptive, I suppose, is because, particularly in that second paragraph, they link things together. So they link darkness with lagoon with mountain lake. So they have noticed patterns, which links us back to that table we did earlier about textures, colours, and something more ominous. They have noticed that there is 2 different ways, I suppose, in which this island is presented, one which is positive, one which is negative, and they've used paragraphs to show that, but they've also used patterns as well, and they've also consistently used their devices which are relevant there. So in order to get level 4, it says analyses the effects of writer's choice of language, which they've done, selects judicious range of textual detail, which they've done, not long quotes as you can see, they haven't copied out huge chunks of writing, and makes sophisticated and accurate use of some terminology. Maybe if they'd have called it an abstract noun rather than just a noun, they would have got 8 out of 8 perhaps. But it is sophisticated, they're all accurate, and they have used them to almost enhance or complement their analysis. So if you could write something like that, then that would be very impressive indeed. Okay, so that concludes this presentation using Lord of the Flies to practice language analysis. In summary then, very similar to what I've been saying before, make sure that you have your devices, make sure that you quote, but using short quotes, and also make sure you think about effects and using words like implies or foregrounds or suggests or reinforces or presents can be really helpful in presenting those effects and the impacts on readers. So always think about language as a conscious decision, it's a deliberate thing, it's forcing you to think of a particular thing or setting in a particular way, and therefore we've got to tell the examiner why you think it's presented in that way, how you feel about it, but also how in terms of what devices. So that is again another video about language analysis.